Hello, Warp Factor. This is Alex Wallace. I'm back with a second author talk episode today. For, today we have Wil McCarthy, who has recently published his Prometheus Award nominated novel Richmond Sky, which I reviewed for Warp Factor last last March. Will, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Wil McCarthy, and I am an engineer and an inventor and a journalist and a novelist. Rich Man's Sky is, I think, my 13th book. Uh, I have lost count, apparently. Uh, but anyway, great to be here.
Uh, Happy to have you aboard as always. You may have seen in the viewership may have seen my my glowing review of Rich Man Sky. We'll start off like what ideas were you exploring when you were writing this? At least on your end, what are you thinking about? What made you want to write this in the way you wrote it?
Well, it's a book about private space programs, and so you don't have to look too far for inspiration there, because that is happening right now. Um, the thing that really kicked it off is looking, just for example, at SpaceX. Uh, about 15 years ago, NASA started work on a new uh, booster rocket, unimaginatively called the Space Launch System, or SLS, which is the same thing they called the space shuttle. Um, and they were also working on a new space capsule called the Orion space capsule that would let people go back to the moon or on asteroid missions into deep space. So they started work on this 15 years ago, and here it is 15 years later, and they're still not there. Um, and this is kind of typical of what we've come to expect from NASA. Very slow, very turgid progress, and very subject to the whims of politics. You know, a new administration comes in, they have all new priorities. They fire the head of NASA, they bring in a new head of NASA that shares their priorities, and uh, so then projects get scrapped, or they get backburnered, or they get slowed way down. Uh, and so this is kind of, for most people alive today, this is our experience of the space program. Um, and then SpaceX comes along, and starting from nothing, uh, they start uh, building rocket boosters, and they fail, and they blow up, and then they don't, and now they're reaching orbit, and now they have their own space capsule, and now they're the main delivery mechanism for astronauts to and from the International Space Station. And all of this has happened on this very compressed timeline, um, that it doesn't just leave NASA in the dust, but the cost of a SpaceX launch was already a small fraction of the cost of anyone else's launch. And then they started doing this amazing trick of landing the first stage booster on its tail so that it could be reused. And that dropped the cost of a launch by another huge fraction. And that's a trick that no one else was even thinking about. No one else said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we simply landed the first stage on its tail like a magic trick? It was only sort of the large personality of Elon Musk saying, this is physically possible, and I want you guys to do it. This is what I'm paying you for. This is your job to make that happen. Um, and that kind of audacious thinking by an individual, by a highly motivated individual, drove things forward at this uh, pace that to me was kind of borderline alarming. Um, Certainly, I worked for 10 years in the aerospace industry, and it didn't move that fast. And if somebody's moving that fast, it means that everything else is being left in the dust, and things are crumbling. And uh, so it's very much to call it disruptive is an understatement, considerably. So my thought was, okay, let's say if we continue making this sort of alarming level of progress for another 30 years. What does that look like? Well, it looks alarming, uh, especially to the people on Earth who aren't participating in that progress. You know, Governments on Earth and corporations on Earth would very much see themselves as the victims of that progress rather than the beneficiaries, even if they actually are beneficiaries in some ways. Uh, People are very leery of this idea that one person is driving the agenda, uh, and with good reason. I mean, we fought a revolution to get away from that, uh, and we're a very Americans at least are a very cantankerous people, uh, and we don't. Uh, in times of crisis, we'll fall behind a leader, but for the most part, we solve all of our problems by squabbling about them. And so, this sort of uh, autocratic idea of one person being in charge of this vast enterprise and deciding what's going to happen, um, it's an idea that will not sit well with a lot of the people on Earth. And so, what I was thinking about was the juxtaposition of uh, rapid progress on the one hand and alarm on the part of uh, institutions on Earth uh, on the other hand, and just saying, well, what does that look like? You roll that out 30 years, what does it look like? Uh, and so that's that's where I was coming from. That's how it started.
I see. I find your comment very interesting. Is that for a long time it was like the snail's pace of NASA trying to develop anything. It was the experience of the space program for many years. I mean, I say this as someone who was born in 1996. It there were times when I felt like the era of great space exploration is gone, and now it's just puttering along, saying we're going to do things, and only sometimes actually doing them. But now we have the South African Twitter shitposter who just bought Twitter, and he's the one putting us into space now, and it feels, I don't know, partially very cyberpunk, but also partially very, I don't know, 18th century, and like this like the British East India Company. Like,
Right.
yeah, I have an internet friend who likes to say that Elon Musk is like a 19th century captain of industry, like an Andrew Carnegie or there's a meatpacking guy or the Paul Pullman or those people. He's the J.P. Morgan's the meat guy. Sorry.
Yeah,
So
and I think a lot of that is valid, but I think probably your comparison to the East India Company is even more apt, uh, because the British East India Company had resources far beyond what most governments on Earth had at that time, and it was kind of under the control of the British, but mostly it was its own entity that did its own thing. And Britain benefited greatly from the existence of the East India Company, but a lot of a lot of people were sort of dictated to by it, or their lives were in thrall to it in one way or another. And I'm not trying to diss private space programs. I think they're great. But they do have there's this tension between the desire to be free and the desire to be democratic, and personal autonomy and all that, uh, with the desire to have bold things happen. And I think that those two things are, uh, to a large extent, not compatible. Uh, and so we're going to keep feeling that tension as time moves forward.
yeah, having read the book, the antagonist Iqbal Renz very much strikes me as that sort of eccentric rich guy with a bunch of weird ideas. I won't spoil it for the readership, but he has some really weird and interesting things he's up to. So yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty fair to say that he's an Elon Musk style figure, where he is he's rich, he's a genius, and he's very, very odd. And I mean, having that kind of money means you can get away with being odd. And and I'm not sure if Musk is at the East India Company yet. We still do not have Muskville on Mars that he runs as his personal fiefdom, but your antagonist Iqbal Renz kind of has that with a space station, and so yeah, I can totally see the British East India Company comparison. And I mean, really, the 18th century was the most cyberpunk era in the history of humanity thus far.
Interesting. I find it interesting that you would identify Iqbal Renz as the antagonist of the story. There are, of course, there are four trillionaires in
Oh,
the book, each of whom has their own private space program, and each of whom has their own agenda. And all of the agendas are weird, and all of the resources at the command of these trillionaires, who were called the Four Horsemen. Um, um, they have, the ability to command resources beyond what the scale of what anyone has access to today, what any one person does. Um, and uh, so one of the things that I tried to do in the book is to say that everyone has their own agenda, not just the four horsemen themselves, but the president of the United States has an agenda, and the people that are under the command of the president of the United States have their own agendas, which don't necessarily line up. And the Catholic Church has its own agenda, um, and everyone's right. No one's wrong per se with their particular cross section of the earth, and their particular experiences. What they're doing makes sense. I would identify as the antagonist of the story a different horseman, Grigory Orlov, who is sort of a plutocrat, uh, uh, in the Grand Russian tradition,
yes. He's a Russian
and
oligarch who, if you were around today, would have his yacht seized by some Western government. But
now, at the moment, things are not going well for the Russian oligarchs. They are dropping like flies, uh, and it'll be interesting to see how all of that shakes out. But anyway, Grigor Orlov emerges from that environment. He emerges from, his father is a captain of industry, is a captain of a particular industry where the murder rate is very high, uh, and this is Grigory Orlov's upbringing. So he has his own private space program, but he comes out of the Russian oil and gas industry. Um, so everything that he does makes perfect sense to him from that standpoint. But from the standpoint of somebody who doesn't come from that environment, it doesn't look too good.
yeah, so he has this sort of paranoia that comes from a environment that cutthroat, and it is a very cutthroat sector of the Russian economy. And so it's one of those things where it just looks very odd to someone who isn't from that environment because he's used to responding to such different incentives. So
Yeah, and when we talk about cutthroat politics here, I mean, when we talk about the cable TV industry in the 80s and early 90s, you know, that was by American standards a cutthroat industry, but no one's throat literally got cut. So there's a there's a sort of a difference in scale there.
yeah, yes, absolutely. The Russians go big with everything, and that includes competition. Uh, I mean, I'm reminded of the Russian saying from the '90s: "Everything the Communist Party told us about communism was a lie. Unfortunately, everything they told us about capitalism was true."
Yeah, um, that's true. There's another Russian idiom or Russian expression, Russian saying that that made its way into the book, which is it translates perfectly from Russian into English. Uh, the world is divided into the who and the whom. In other words, the people who are doing things and the people to whom things are done. And that's a very Russian way of looking at it. Um, and you can see it playing out without getting, too much into it. You can see that attitude very much playing out today.
Yeah, I mean, having read your book, I can absolutely see that the theme of that saying running through it, because it's about, as I understand it, your book is about capitalism going to space and doing capitalism in its most cutthroat, most ruthless form. And so yeah, it strikes me as very much one of the big themes of the novel. And you could say it's the Earth governments trying to remain whose and not whom's because of certain actions of a certain Mr. Iqbal Rens.
Yes, quite so. And I wanted to tell the story. I mean, parts of the story can only really be told through the eyes of the horseman or through the eyes of the people who are immediately adjacent to the horseman. But really, for me, this story is told from a lot of points of view. But for me, the protagonist um, is uh, uh, this this person who is a um, she's a pararescueman from the U.S. Air Force, and she's been sent on a secret mission to outer space. Officially she's resigned from the Air Force, but unofficially she's very much still uh, uh, under the command of the U.S. government, and she kind of embodies all of that conflict. Um, she's a soldier, she's a good soldier, but when you're out there, it's different. And the president of the United States doesn't necessarily get it. Uh, and in a weird way, she's in a perfect position to sort of understand the totality of what's going on, even though uh, she doesn't feel like she understands very much of what's going on. Her impressions uh, are really what in a lot of ways what drives the story along.
Yeah, absolutely. It's I mean for the spy fiction fans among the viewership, it's also very much a spy novel, just in space, and it has the politicking and the whole cloak and dagger sort of thing. It's just thrown out of the Earth orbit, and it's very clever for a number of reasons. That among them, and okay, and shifting gears a bit. This is a question prompted uh by the Prometheus Award nomination you got, and so it's a libertarian thing. It's a very much that free market, individual freedom sort of philosophy that it supports. Whereas, I mean, me reading it, I sort of got the impression that it felt sort of a leftist, anti-capitalist. I mean, I think it would at least support that reading because it's about what the billionaires can do in space and how this is concerning. Where would you say that the narrative falls on that spectrum?
Oh, it falls all over it, and this is, in a way, I think that my own particular point of view isn't necessarily represented in that book at all, uh, because I didn't live the life that all these other people lived. So they've got their own unique experiences and their own unique points of view that don't necessarily line up with mine. Um, the book has been criticized for being too lefty, too woke, too inclusive, too kind of self-consciously inclusive of people of different backgrounds. So that's one criticism that people have levied at it. But the exact opposite, people have said equally that it's a sexist, uh, kind of patriarchal story. Uh, Even though the main character is a woman and the president of the United States is also a woman, uh, it does lend itself to that criticism as well, just based on some of the kind of structural characteristics of the environment. Um, and the Prometheus Award Committee picked up on the libertarian themes of free market, free enterprise, and what it can do, and that's in there. It's definitely in there, but it's all in there. Uh, the all of the uh, points of view that would importantly play out in that environment. I think I like to think are represented. So I think in that sense it becomes a bit of a Rorschach test that what I'm finding is that people look at the story and they see themselves and and they imagine that I had a particular uh, point of view in my mind while I was writing it. Whereas what I was actually trying to do was to hold all of those points of view in my head at the same time.
I see. I mean, I'm reminded of the internet saying that if you're annoying both the left and the right that much, you're doing something right. And I mean, I thought it was a very fair book. I thought it was. It didn't strike me as an outright political tract. I didn't think it was particularly quote unquote woke. I mean, I'm half Filipino, so when people do that sort of representation wrong, it irks me because it feels patronizing. I did not get that from this book at all. I thought it handled the diversity well, and also the main character Alice Kyung, she's Korean American, and it opens with her arguing with her Korean immigrant mother, and I have to say that very much reminded me of my own Filipina immigrant mother. Okay, so I just have to ask, did you do any particular research for that segment? Because it felt so incredibly true to life to me, and I liked it a lot.
Uh, what I was trying to do there, there's a kind of person that I think is not well described by science, but appears a lot in literature, um, and I wanted to sort of uh, show people where Alice comes from because it would make it easier to understand how she reacts to the events of the book and the places and environments of the book. Um, but Alice's mother is what I would classify as an incompetent sociopath. Um, she's a person who's entirely focused on herself. She thinks about herself. She's got this very sort of narcissistic view of the world. But the classic sociopath, the sociopath that we all imagine is this sort of smooth, suave manipulator of people. And there are definitely sociopaths like that out there, but there are also, I think, a lot of incompetent sociopaths who just don't really get the world. They don't really understand how things work. And so when Alice is talking to her mother, it's all about her mother. It's sort of a very one-sided conversation, and it's very uh, frustrating for Alice. But also, Alice sees herself in that. She sees that she's also a very self-involved person, and also uh, I mean, she's a very competent person. The reason she's being sent on this mission is because she has some very finely honed skills and very finely honed emotional responses so that she can be counted on in these very, very tense environments, very tense situations. But like a lot of people who make that description, her personal life is a complete train wreck. Um, and the reason her personal life is a train wreck is because she's her mother's daughter, and I wanted to start the book with that uh, sort of introduction, so that Alice's journey through cislunar space becomes that much more illuminating, that much more hilarious, that much more sort of poignant, uh, etc.
Yeah, I have to say I have known had many Asian friends, they have described their own parents in very similar terms. So I don't know how you did it, but you really struck a nerve in a good way. I think that you really got to the heart of it in this sort of hard ass immigrant personality that I've heard also happen in other immigrant communities. So kudos to you, Mr. McCarthy. You got it very well. Uh,
Well, thank you. I'm very, very flattered to hear that.
and- okay,
Uh,
so
I think one of the things about being, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, you go on. That's not interesting.
One of the things about being a novelist, at least, you know, I think when you're a young novelist, oftentimes it's more about the ideas than it is about the people. But uh, most literature is very much focused on people, and so by extension, most novelists have to be very much students of human nature, uh, and not just able to predict how people are going to react, but to embed yourself in the point of view that produces that behavior. I think that's a very important skill uh, in fiction writing generally, and no less true in science fiction. The thing that's harder in science fiction, at least in the corner of science fiction that I write, I don't necessarily like to hit people over the head with the science, but I do a lot of calculating and a lot of uh, you know, it, one of the problems with hard science fiction is people have to get from here to there. They have to expend a certain amount of energy. It takes them a certain amount of time to get there, et cetera, et cetera. And all these details have to be right. And oftentimes they very much constrain the kind of story that you're able to tell. But also from those constraints, that's where a lot of creativity springs up. And that's a long-winded answer to your comment. But this is hopefully uh, the humanity of the character comes across in that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, science fiction is about how humans interact with technology, and the human element is just as important as the technological element because I mean that's the whole idea. That it's about putting humans in these strange and interesting situations that are not currently uh real, although frankly 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, this novel seemed very plausible to me looking into later into this century, going next century. It just
Uh-huh.
it just feels like some rich asshole will do this, and I think you were very incisive there. Uh, it's I'm also reminded of the advice to science fiction fantasy writers: do your world building not necessarily to show all of it to your reader because that's a lot, and then that will break the pacing and whatnot. But so in the case if your narrative goes to a place you don't know you didn't think it was going to go, you'll have an idea how whatever this situation could play out of because you know the rules of the rest of the world, so you know how certain things interact, and that's what the way you discuss the science in your story. It very much feels like it. You you know how elements X, Y, and Z already work. So if you throw an element A into it, you'll at least have an idea of how X, Y, and Z react to A. And so it feels more coherent, it feels more cohesive, and it just makes sense in a way it wouldn't if you hadn't done all that world building.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely, and I'll actually take it a step further. It's good to know a lot more about the world than what you say in your story, not just in case the story goes in an unexpected direction, but I find that that uh, just your word choice, the the way that you choose to describe things, um, changes when you know. If you're writing by the seat of your pants, if you don't really know very much and you're just kind of creating a narrative, that produces a certain kind of very spare uh, text. Um, and a lot of times my first drafts look like that. They are very spare. Um, I write 4 drafts. I used to write 3, but as I've gotten older, I've settled on four as the right number. But by the time I get to that fourth draft, uh, I know who the characters are. I know an awful lot about the world. I know an awful lot about the politics and the science and the intrigues and uh, all of that. And the way that the sentences and the paragraphs are constructed is just deeper and richer. Not only does it contain more words, but just the descriptions evoke a certain sense that they wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah, there's, you could call it colorful, you could call it flavorful. There's just a feeling there, this immersion that you wouldn't have
Yes.
before. This sense that it's a lived in world, it is a cohesive world, it's a believable world, if not necessarily a realistic world, in that it's worked out, the elements interact well, and it's just internally consistent, which I think is a very good thing. I mean, I'm reminded of I have a writer friend who lives in Colombia, and he was talking about how the historical novelist Edward Rutherford was at a book festival in Colombia, and he said that about 10 to 20% of his research actually gets into the book. And if you're familiar with Edward Rutherford, his books are like this thick, so you get an idea of how much research is done for books like this. And I'd say for the speculative genres as much as historical fiction, and and then I think more broadly that's why there's a certain degree of overlap between the two. So so
Yeah, I mean, a really good case in point that was very instructive for me, um, say 20 years ago, uh, was Red Mars by Kim Stanley Robinson. It was very evident to me what he had done to construct that story, which was to read. Um, there was a series of books called The Case for Mars, which was just huge collections of technical papers about how to live on Mars. Here's how to make concrete. Here's how to make an airtight enclosure using nothing but native materials. Here's how to extract gases from the atmosphere and separate them into the gases that you need. Um, so it was very evident to me, and I later had a conversation with Stan, and he confirmed it. He had read The Case for Mars, all four volumes cover to cover, uh, and also the this part. I'm not sure he confirmed this, but I think he also read the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness, um, and with this information all in his head, he told a story. And the story is just a story. You know what I mean? But all of this information is in his head and it really shows.
yes,
And
I
so
mean,
it feels very, very real.
yeah, I'm a big fan of Kim Stanley Robinson. I've read like maybe 10, 12 of his books by now. Actually, the first piece I wrote for Warp Factor was a review of The Ministry for the Future. So yeah, and I absolutely see what you mean by that. Having read the Mars trilogy, it's dense, but it's also very human, almost infuriatingly so. Like he doesn't turn it into a myth. He shows the people who would be pioneers on Mars to be infuriatingly human, and they're all deeply flawed, and they all make you so mad at one point or another. But as I said, you need the human element and the scientific element, and so I think he did very well with that, and I think he does very well with that in all his books.
Not that I'm trying to compare myself to Kim Stanley Robinson. Let me hasten to add. Uh, I don't think my writing is very much like his.
Yeah,
Um, and I don't strive to be anything other than the best one of me.
I mean, yeah, your pacing is, I think, is closer to like a thriller pacing. It's like not exactly that, but it's leaner than Robinson, but only because most writing in human existence is leaner than Robinson. Because he's very dense, he's very lush, he loves going on like 5-page tangents about political philosophy, and I didn't see that here. You have a much more, I mean, not to call Kim Stanley Robinson unfocused, but a more focused narrative, and it's more very much one particular set of plot lines rather than the almost encyclopedic discussions of both history and science that Robinson really does like to do. And
Sure, sure.
I mean, I like both styles. I think they both have their own place. Um, I enjoyed both your work and his. So yeah,
Well, I like to think that even with the tighter pacing, I like that word pacing. That's a good description, I think. I do try to write stories that don't drag. If I find it dragging, I try to tighten that part of it up. Um, but I do like to think that having all the information in your head comes across, even if you're not barfing out all of the details. I think even with a more tightly paced story, there's just uh, more of that sense of authenticity.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and yeah, pacing I think is the big difference. Like there are times when Robinson will, in the Mars trilogy, he goes on this long discussion of like I don't know Martian geology, and like in cinematic terms, I think the effect would be like this big, long establishing shot of the Martian surface, like sort of like Lawrence of Arabia, kinda.
Uh,
And Richmond Sky doesn't really do that, and it's a different type of writing, different type of story, and it's one I think that really works in the particular context that you created in that.
that's a really good observation because the problem with establishing shots, I love establishing shots in movies and in literature, but for me, for my writing, the problem with that kind of establishing shot is that's not what a human sees. A human isn't looking down on the totality of Martian geology. A person is walking through a valley, and so all they see are the strata of the valley that they happen to be in at that moment. And maybe a glint of something shiny at the top. Uh, and so I'd like to know what all of that is, but I like to write it through the eyes of a person who's really only can only see what they're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, and in a way, we're back to the human element versus the technological element because we can, in a sense, see the whole thing from the top, but we have to be in an airplane or looking through a satellite or some other mediating thing that lets us go against gravity, as opposed to the very intimate. You're in the valley. You're going through Mars. You're looking at the rocks, and and so they're different focuses, and they can both work in their own way.
Sure, sure. And you know, one of the goals with a kaleidoscopic novel, I mean, not all of my novels are told from multiple viewpoints. But when a novel is told from multiple viewpoints, the hope is that through the totality of all of the viewpoints, you get a picture of the world that's bigger than what any of the individual characters can
Yeah,
see. And that's your sort of special privilege as the reader.
and also a sense of the special privilege of the writer because they're the one who's creating all of this. And I mean, my literary background of sorts and the fandom I'm involved in and the stuff I write is alternate history. So we have a very similar thing when we change history, we try to see all of it, and it's a genre that lends itself to that kaleidoscopic novel. Like Harry Turtlelove has written like two big series about using that about alternate histories, and it's something many people have tried to emulate,
I,
and some of them are good, some of them aren't.
I think alternate history and hard science fiction have a lot in common. Um, a lot of the time in hard science fiction, you can't know. Uh, you're relying on some kind of future technology that hasn't been invented yet, or some future science that hasn't really been fully nailed down yet. Um, and that's okay. That's within the bounds of the subgenre, but you have to do it rigorously. Like everything has to be right except this place where you're making the leap, and the leap has to be plausible. And you have the same problem in alternate history. You have to sound like you know your history so that when you change one critical thing, the results that branch off of that are authentic. It's not just a mishmash of whatever you feel like writing. It all sort of flows from what must be.
Yes, absolutely. They're both thought experiment genres in a very certain sense that it's grounded in a reality in the way that space opera isn't, and there's high value placed on the perceived adherence to the underlying reality, and so they can be judged quite strongly on both, and to good or for ill.
Sure, sure. One of the challenges that I like to set for myself is to sort of keep the sense of wonder and the pacing of a space opera uh, with the scientific rigor of a hard science fiction novel. And you know that's so difficult to do that I can't really say that I'm as successful as I'd like to be with it. But that's certainly the goal that I aspire to in all of my writing. Not all of it, but when it's in space.
Yes, I mean that's one of the best ways of doing it, because it's again it's about balancing the human and the technological, and that investment, particularly in the characters, is one of the ways you get people to keep caring about the story. I mean, as you said, space opera at its best does that. I mean, look at Star Wars. We all love Luke. We all love Leia. We love Han. We utterly hate Anakin, but that's still an emotion that makes you keep watching. People do love to hate certain characters, and that is very much a thing in certain space opera.
Now, I just I have to get on my Star Wars hobby horse for just a minute here. I think that the more I've seen of the Star Wars saga, and the longer I've had to think about it, the more I think that it's really the story. It's the incredible story of Emperor Palpatine. Um, when we first see him in The Empire Strikes Back, he's just a hologram that says, "Okay, do this." Um, and when we see him in uh, uh, Return of the
Okay.
Jedi, he's sort of saying, "Yes, feel your anger," and it's not very well drawn out. But even at that time, George Lucas had in his mind the way that Palpatine became the evil emperor, and we see that arc. People diss the Phantom Menace, and rightly so. It's a terrible movie in a lot of ways, but what it did was give you this guy that was so inherently trustworthy that no one thought to ever distrust him, uh, and hand the reins of power. He's the only guy that everybody trusts. So they hand the reins of power over to him, and everything else flows out of that. Um, and uh, for him to sort of manipulate the entire galaxy into finding him to be that harmless uh, is just this brilliant masterstroke that I think is vastly underrated. So I felt the need to say that.
I mean, I'm a Star Wars fan too, and I mean, so I got into Star Wars late 2000 when I was about what 10, 12 years old, and so there's a part of me that still thinks of Star Wars as sex movies, which is a very particular slice of age, and I also remember liking that plot line, and the more history I read, the more I see it happen again and again and again. And so I can absolutely see where Lucas is coming from in terms of the human element. And And but I disagree a little bit because if you take the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy and you take them as the six movies of a single narrative, uh, it's the rise, fall, and redemption of Anakin Skywalker, which I think he's probably the real core around it, but that could be argued about for a very, very, very long time.
Yes, let's schedule let's pencil that in for the future.
I mean, I could arrange it. Okay. Anyways, back to your actual book, which is why we are discussing his together. What else is there? Okay. Here's a bit of another question that was prompted by the way you talked about the book's reception. The depiction of gender in this book. Is there anything you sought to do in this book? Because there are many female characters and portrayed very differently, and the whole one of the whole reasons that they send her is the particular odd inclinations of Iqbal Ren's. And just were you doing any what were you doing with gender in this book in your mind?
Well, I think you've kind of hit on it there. You know, Iqbal Renz has this penchant for staffing his space station with almost exclusively women, um, and he does a lot of other big, grandiose things that seem very threatening from the vantage point of Earth. And so it's very easy at the beginning of the story to just say, well, this is a Bond villain type of guy. You know, he's a he's a rich, powerful weirdo who surrounds himself with women and is very dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. The truth is more complicated than that. And Alice, because of her own peculiar background, is actually well aligned to get Iqbal Renz and understand what he's actually up to. Um, so I like that you know, the whole reason that Alice is going on this mission is because uh, Iqbal Renz is scary and the government needs to assert some control over the situation there. Um, and Alice is sent because she is a physically attractive person who has qualifications that would make her an attractive astronaut candidate to live on this space station. That's the reason that she's selected, but that's the reason she's attract. That's the reason Iqbal Renz picks her. But the reason the government set her up as a candidate is because she also has all of these military skills that will allow her to uh, project the will of the United States government to L1. Um, so uh, the that's kind of the background that drives the gender politics. It you know it's I didn't make it up. It's just a fact that all the self-made billionaires, except for Oprah, all the self-made billionaires are men. Um, and so when we start looking at these you know, private space programs, these trillionaireocracies of the future, they're going to be run by men. Um, it's just in the nature, testosterone makes people hyper competitive, and so men are much more likely to invest the time and energy and resources necessary to be in that position in the first place. Um, so that sets up a very sexist dynamic right at the outset. And a lot of people see that and they pick up on it and they assume that it's a sexist book. And so I wanted to balance that very much with a female point of view. Uh, and, you know, it's a, you look at the cover, uh, I'm going to grab a copy of the book. This is a very sexy cover. Uh, Dave Seeley picked this up. This is a scene from about the middle of the book with sexy women in suspended animation on their way to L1 uh, to become, you know, allegedly part of Iqbal Renz's harem. Um, So I wanted the book to have this kind of erotic thread running through it, and also it takes place in this very kind of sexist uh, situation. So it was very, very important that the women in the story be real people
Yes.
uh, who have their own point of view about the whole thing. You know, why are they doing this? Why are they signing up for this? And they each have their own different reasons. And so I, it just that was an important part of the construction of the
Yeah.
novel.
I mean, yeah, it is. And believe I mentioned this in my review of it. It's a premise that, if you hear it in isolation, sounds like it could have been done in a way much worse than you did, because you're a good writer, and you made a very intelligent uh, science fiction novel, which felt like the golden age stuff I read when I was a kid that my dad had, and I feel like that at least some people would be at risk of judging it as something that it isn't, because I think it's a hell of a lot better than that, and also, at least in my circles, Bain as a publisher is stereotyped for being for making that, and I think that's a gross simplification given all I've read from them. And so, yeah, I think it's very smart, and I think that was, I mean, I think was handled well, but I'm a guy, so I'm not in the best position to judge.
Well, and you know, your allusion to the golden age, I think, is accurate. The problem with golden age science fiction, a lot of it did have accurate science, and a lot of it did manage to blend the sense of wonder with technical realism, but um, there was a lot of misogyny,
Yeah,
um, not necessarily overt misogyny, but sort of embedded assumptions about what women were and weren't capable of
yeah,
that that you know not just frame the story, but they just kind of ooze out of the prose. So I've got a 21-year-old daughter who has really tried hard to read Heinlein and can't get into it uh, because it feels so alien to her and so uh, uh, you know, like the women. Heinlein was a feminist in his own way, but the world that he lived in was so different from ours that the women that he portrayed just don't really resemble the real women of today.
yeah,
Um, and this is a problem. And this is sort of the albatross around the neck of golden age science fiction.
yeah. I mean,
But as writers today, we can try to capture some of that same pathos, uh, but in a more fair and even-handed and realistic way.
absolutely. I mean, I read a Reddit comment a couple days ago. It was saying that Heinlein was fighting different battles than we were, and by the standards of the mid 20th century, he is rather shockingly progressive in many ways.
Right.
And
Agreed.
I mean, and you're right in that a lot of that old stuff is has those very mid-century assumptions about gender roles. Like, I think Asimov's Foundation has like one female character. She doesn't really do anything, and yeah, oftentimes less openly calling women inferior and more ignoring them,
Yes.
for lack of a better term. And yeah, your book very much struck me as trying to get that sense of wonder, that engagement with technology, but like with a better understanding of this sort of thing and a better depiction of this sort of thing, which I think is the right way to go about mining from old science fiction, because a lot of it is good, but there are parts that age poorly, and we should be honest about that.
Sure. The other thing that golden age science fiction did when it wasn't ignoring women, it was sexualizing them.
Yes.
And what I was trying to do with this book, part of one of the many hundreds of things I was trying to do with this book is to say it's okay. It's okay to sexualize women. It's okay to sexualize men. It's okay to have uh, you know, sexually charged scenarios. I mean, I hear from people who've been to Antarctica. That can be a pretty sexually charged environment itself. It's remote. You know, people are kind of stuck together in sort of high density situations,
And with only so
uh,
much to do.
in, with only so much to do, and with a fairly good gender mix. And so a realistic handling of a scenario like that, it is going to be at times very erotically charged, but it's okay to sexualize women as people, uh, not as
Object.
objects who are only sexual and nothing else.
But that is an aspect of the human experience, and if you're portraying it fairly, that's there's nothing wrong with that.
Two guys talking about it, so
Yes,
right there.
I mean, well, I appeared on a Matt Mitrovich's show about bad sex scenes all in history, and again, it was two guys. So this is not even the first time I've done this, which I don't know what that says about me, or Will, or Matt, or the genres. That is something. I'm certain we will get raked through the coals through it, and quite possibly we will deserve it. But I mean, I just try to be fair. Uh, yeah. How do I go with that?
Well, there are two sequels to the book. Um, the next one is Poor Man's Sky, which I learned last week is coming out in January. Um, so that'll be out. If it follows the same pattern as Rich Man's Sky, it'll come out in hardcover and ebook uh, at the same time, and then sometime after that, it'll come out in audio, and then the paperback will lag considerably behind that. Um, but that book is done. It's kind of on rails at this point. Dave Seeley's doing the cover art again, so I'm charged about that. Um, and then the third book in the series is Beggar's Sky. Uh, Middle book is Poor Man's Sky. I may not have mentioned the title. Beggar's Sky is still, I'm still working on the first draft, so I'm perhaps 10 or 20% of the way through the first draft. I haven't really counted.
Okay. Okay, so we're running up to about an hour. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Uh, well, I guess there are some things that you see in Rich Man's Sky that may not seem very important or consequential at the moment that you see them, uh, but that play out in a big way in the subsequent two books. So, uh, in that sense, for people who may be reading it for the first time, uh, it might just be fun to know that it's not necessarily evident which of those details are going to uh, blossom into whole big situations of their own.
I mean, that's the fun of trilogies and other big series of that nature. Had a lot of fun with the works of Timothy Zahn for that. So yeah. Unless there's anything else, thank you very much, Will, for being on our show, our second guest, and I will, in all likelihood, review the sequel for the site too. So,
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a great time.
and thank you for being here.